A small can of tomato paste may not look like the beginning of an economic revolution. You can hold it in one hand, place it in the kitchen cabinet, and use it without ever thinking about where the tomatoes came from. But in Burkina Faso, that simple product is beginning to represent a much larger question. Can an African country grow its own food, process more of it at home, build its own distribution network, and eventually sell the finished product to its neighbors instead of depending so heavily on processed imports? That is why the story of SOFATO matters. Behind one can are farmers growing tomatoes in Burkina Faso, workers operating a processing plant, citizens whose money helps support community-based investment, distributors carrying cartons across the country, and families deciding whether the final product deserves a place in their kitchens. And there is a fascinating contradiction behind this story. Burkina Faso can grow tomatoes and has even sold large quantities of fresh tomatoes across its borders. Yet the country has also imported millions of pounds of processed tomato products from abroad. That is the economic gap SOFATO is trying to help close. Ibrahim Traore did not create SOFATO from nothing. The project existed before his leadership and had faced serious difficulties. What makes his role important is that his government helped revive the project and connected it to a much broader vision: produce more at home, process more at home, encourage local investment, and keep more economic value inside Burkina Faso. If stories about Africa building value from its own resources matter to you, stay with us and subscribe, because this story goes far beyond one can of tomato paste. The real question is, what happens next? Can a tomato grown by a farmer in Burkina Faso move through a locally supported factory, reach families across the country, and eventually find customers in Mali, Niger, Ghana, and the wider West African market? If that happens competitively and sustainably, this little can could become something much bigger than food. It could become a test of whether economic sovereignty can move from speeches and political promises into factories, trucks, stores, kitchens, and eventually markets across the Sahel. Before SOFATO can become a regional brand, the story begins with something far less glamorous: a farmer trying to sell tomatoes before they spoil. Fresh tomatoes do not wait patiently for the market. When harvests arrive in large volumes, farmers may face falling prices because the crop is perishable. If buyers cannot absorb the supply quickly, part of that harvest can lose value or go to waste. For a farming family, that is not an abstract economic problem. It can mean months of work losing value in a matter of days. Processing changes that equation. Instead of moving only from the farm to a fresh produce market, tomatoes can move from the farm into a factory. There they can be processed, packaged, stored, transported, and sold over a much longer period. That creates another possible buyer for local farmers while adding new stages where value can be created inside Burkina Faso. This is where SOFATO enters the picture. Its plant at Yako was designed to process about 100 metric tons of tomatoes per day. In American measurements, that is roughly 110 US tons every day. That figure is the plant's design processing capacity. It does not mean the factory actually processes that amount every single day, and that distinction matters. Still, the capacity shows the scale of the ambition. This is no longer simply a farmer carrying baskets of tomatoes to a nearby market. It is an attempt to connect agriculture with industrial processing. Think about the difference. A fresh tomato has a short clock running against it. A properly processed tomato product can remain available much longer and travel much farther. That gives Burkina Faso an opportunity to capture more value between the field and the kitchen. But a processing plant alone does not guarantee farmers better incomes. SOFATO still needs reliable supplies, workable purchasing arrangements, efficient production, and customers willing to buy its product. And before any of that could happen, someone had to finance the machinery, buildings, and operations. That brings us to one of the most unusual parts of the SOFATO story: where the money came from and how Ibrahim Traore's government became involved. The SOFATO story becomes more interesting when we look at who paid for the industrial capacity behind it. This factory was not originally Ibrahim Traore's idea. The project existed before his leadership, and that distinction is important. According to official accounts from Burkina Faso, the project had encountered serious difficulties. Traore later said that when his government became involved, those behind the project were close to giving up. His administration chose to support its revival and connect it with a broader economic strategy centered on community investment and domestic production. The investment in the Yako plant was officially reported at about 5.65 billion CFA francs, roughly 10 million US dollars depending on the exchange rate. About 1 billion CFA francs, approximately $1.8 million, came from Burkina Faso's Economic and Social Development Fund. Another 400 million CFA francs, roughly $700,000, came through the agency promoting community enterprises. Much of the broader financing structure was connected to what Burkina Faso calls popular shareholding. Put simply, the idea is to mobilize savings from ordinary citizens and investors so that Burkinabe capital can help finance productive businesses instead of relying entirely on outside investors or foreign borrowing. That does not guarantee success. Community ownership cannot make an inefficient factory profitable. The company still has to control costs, maintain quality, sell its products, and eventually produce returns. But the model changes the meaning of the factory. Official reporting after the inauguration cited roughly 107 direct jobs and more than 1,500 indirect jobs connected to the project. Those figures should be treated as reported employment expectations and estimates rather than proof of permanent jobs over many years. For Traore, the larger principle has been consistent. Burkina Faso should produce more of what it consumes, process more of its own raw materials, and eventually become capable of exporting more finished products. SOFATO therefore gives that political vision a practical test. Citizens can help finance a factory. Farmers can grow the tomatoes. Workers can process them. But none of it matters economically if the finished cans remain stacked inside a warehouse. The next battle is getting them into stores and convincing families to buy them. A factory can have modern machines, workers, and thousands of cans ready for sale. But until those cans reach ordinary families, industrial capacity is only half the story. That is why SOFATO's distribution network matters. The company describes a system that begins at the factory and moves through regional distributors, wholesalers, retailers, neighborhood stores, and finally to consumers. Rather than depending on one distributor for a large market, several distributors can operate in major areas. SOFATO has also said a sales team follows activity in the field to see whether products are actually reaching the places they are supposed to reach. That may sound like ordinary business, but it addresses one of the most common problems facing a new domestic product. Manufacturing something is not enough. It must be available when a customer wants it. The field report we studied offered an encouraging example. One distributor said a previous delivery contained about 1,200 cartons of tomato paste in different sizes. According to his account, most of that shipment had moved quickly. Another delivery of roughly 1,000 cartons then arrived. Those figures come from the distributor interviewed in the report. They are not national audited sales figures, so we should not use them to claim that SOFATO has already conquered Burkina Faso's market. What they do provide is evidence of repeated orders and reported consumer demand at that particular point in the distribution chain. SOFATO originally targeted first-year revenue of roughly 7 billion CFA francs, around 12 million US dollars, depending on the exchange rate. Again, that was a target announced around the factory's launch, not proof that the company later earned $12 million. That distinction matters because this entire economic experiment will ultimately be judged by what happens after the speeches and opening ceremonies. A distributor must be willing to order another truckload. A retailer must be willing to give the product shelf space. And most importantly, a family that buys one must have enough confidence in the quality and price to buy another. If that cycle continues, a factory becomes a business. And Burkina Faso already has a large market for processed tomato products to compete for. Now we come to one of the most revealing contradictions in this story. Burkina Faso grows tomatoes. It sells fresh tomatoes across its borders. Yet the country has also spent money importing millions of pounds of processed tomato products from abroad. Trade data reported by Burkina Faso for 2023 shows imports of about 35.7 million pounds of processed or preserved tomato products under International Trade Category HS 200290. The reported value was approximately 3.82 million US dollars. China supplied the largest volume, followed by Italy, with additional supplies coming from other countries. There is an important detail here. This trade category covers a broader group of processed tomato products. We should not pretend that every pound was exactly the same kind of double concentrated tomato paste produced by SOFATO, but the figures still reveal something important. Burkina Faso already had significant domestic demand for processed tomato products before its new processing capacity began developing. That means SOFATO does not have to convince Burkinabe families to start using processed tomatoes for the first time. It has to convince them to choose a product processed at home. And that changes the economic question. When tomatoes are grown in Burkina Faso but processed products are imported, part of the value created through industrial processing, packaging, branding, and distribution can remain outside the country. SOFATO is an attempt to capture more of those steps at home. The farmer grows the tomato. A Burkinabe factory processes it. Workers package it. Local distributors move it. Retailers sell it. Families consume it. If the system works efficiently, more of that economic activity can circulate inside Burkina Faso. But replacing imports should not become an excuse to ignore competition. A local product still has to offer acceptable quality, reliable supply, and a price families can afford. The goal is not simply to remove a foreign can from a shelf and replace it with a Burkinabe can at any cost. The stronger goal is to build a domestic product capable of winning that shelf space. And once that happens inside Burkina Faso, the next question becomes even more ambitious. Could the same product compete for shelf space across the AES? If SOFATO succeeds at home, Mali and Niger are the most obvious places to ask what comes next. These countries are not imaginary markets waiting to be created. They already import processed tomato products. In 2023, Mali imported roughly 10.5 million pounds of products classified under the same broad processed tomato trade category we discussed earlier. The reported value was approximately 4.63 million US dollars. Niger imported roughly 12.6 million pounds that year, worth close to 3.98 million US dollars. Those numbers matter because they change the conversation. SOFATO will not have to persuade families in Mali and Niger that processed tomatoes belong in their kitchens. The market already exists. The challenge would be persuading distributors, retailers, and consumers that a product from Burkina Faso deserves part of that market. This is where the alliance of Sahel states could become economically interesting. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger now speak frequently about sovereignty and closer regional cooperation. But political friendship alone will not put a Burkinabe product on a shelf in Bamako or Niamey. SOFATO will still have to compete. Mali and Niger already buy processed tomato products from other suppliers. A Burkina Faso producer would need dependable production, competitive prices, consistent quality, efficient transportation, and distributors capable of keeping stores supplied. That is why we should be careful with claims that SOFATO has already conquered the AES market. The evidence we have does not support that conclusion. What the evidence does support is opportunity. There are neighboring markets already spending millions of dollars on processed tomato products. Burkina Faso is developing domestic processing capacity, and the political relationship among the three Sahel countries could encourage deeper economic ties. Imagine the significance if a tomato grown by a farmer in Burkina Faso were processed at Yako, packed under a Burkinabe brand, transported across the region, and voluntarily chosen by a family in Mali or Niger because the quality and price made sense. That would be more meaningful than a slogan about African self-reliance. It will be regional trade happening in everyday life. And beyond Mali and Niger lies an even larger test: Ghana and the wider West African market. Ghana makes the regional opportunity even more interesting because Burkina Faso does not have to introduce its tomatoes to Ghana from scratch. The two countries already have an established tomato trade. In 2024, Burkina Faso reported exporting roughly 27.9 million pounds of fresh tomatoes to Ghana, worth about 22.15 million US dollars. That tells us something important. Burkinabe farmers are already connected to consumers and traders beyond their national border. But fresh tomatoes and processed tomato products represent two different levels of the value chain. When Burkina Faso exports fresh tomatoes, the country earns income from agriculture and trade. When tomatoes are processed at home, additional economic activity can potentially be created through factory work, packaging, branding, storage, transportation, and distribution. That creates a difficult choice. In 2026, Burkina Faso temporarily restricted fresh tomato exports as authorities sought to secure more raw material for domestic processing. The restrictions were later eased as supplies improved. The episode revealed the tension clearly. Should a country sell its tomatoes immediately to a neighboring market where buyers are ready, or reserve enough of that harvest to feed domestic factories and build a processing industry? There is no simple answer. Farmers need attractive prices today. Factories need dependable supplies if they are expected to survive tomorrow. And Ghana is not simply waiting for Burkina Faso to become its processor. Ghana also wants to strengthen its own tomato industry and reduce dependence on imported processed products. That is why a serious Pan-African economic vision cannot mean that African countries stop competing with one another. They should compete. The difference is that more of the competition can involve African farmers, African factories, African brands, and African distribution networks fighting for African consumers. For SOFATO, Ghana could therefore become an important future test. Burkina Faso has already demonstrated that its fresh tomatoes can cross the border in significant quantities. The next challenge is harder. Can Burkina Faso transform more of that agricultural reputation into a recognizable processed brand that consumers outside the country choose willingly? If the answer eventually becomes yes, the story will have moved from exporting a crop to exporting value. Now we reach the question that can decide whether this entire experiment succeeds or fails. What happens when a locally processed product costs more than an imported alternative? Consumers in Burkina Faso have already raised that concern. It is understandable. A family managing a limited household budget cannot simply ignore price because a product carries a national label. And producing locally does not automatically mean producing cheaply. Consider what goes into one can. Farmers must grow and deliver the tomatoes. The factory must process them. Someone must provide packaging. Electricity must keep equipment operating. Products must be stored, loaded onto trucks, transported to distributors, passed through wholesalers and retailers, and finally placed on a neighborhood shelf. Every step adds cost. Energy is particularly important. Burkina Faso continues to face expensive electricity generation and dependence on imported fuel. Power disruptions can also make industrial production more difficult. For a processing plant, unreliable or expensive energy can affect everything from machinery to storage and packaging. Then, there is scale. A giant international producer that has operated for decades may spread its costs across enormous production volumes. A younger Burkinabe factory may not yet have that advantage. If a plant designed for roughly 110 US tons of tomatoes per day operates well below that level, fixed costs are spread across fewer finished products. That can make each can more expensive. This is why asking citizens to buy local cannot be the entire economic strategy. Patriotism may end the first purchase. Price and quality end the 10th. Supporting a young domestic industry can make sense, especially when it creates jobs and new markets for farmers. But the long-term goal should be to make that industry increasingly efficient, not permanently expensive. SOFATO therefore faces a demanding test. It must improve production, secure enough tomatoes, strengthen distribution, control energy and transportation costs, and expand volume without sacrificing quality. If those pieces come together, prices may become more competitive as the business grows. If they do not, consumers will continue asking a perfectly reasonable question. Why should a product made close to home cost more than one that traveled thousands of miles to reach the same shelf? This brings us directly to Ibrahim Traore and one of the most difficult questions surrounding his economic vision. How much protection should a young domestic industry receive before it must stand on its own? Traore has repeatedly promoted a simple economic direction. Burkina Faso should produce more at home, process more of its own raw materials, consume more locally made goods, and eventually export more finished products. SOFATO fits naturally into that vision. Even though Traore did not originally create the project, his government has also supported community investment and policies intended to give domestic production more room to develop. International financial institutions have raised concerns about parts of this broader approach. The International Monetary Fund has noted Burkina Faso's use of import quotas and restrictions covering some goods that can be produced domestically. It has encouraged alternative policies and a gradual reduction of certain trade restrictions over time. It has also argued that government involvement in the economy should encourage private investment rather than crowd it out. Those concerns deserve to be heard. If a company is protected indefinitely from competition, it may have less pressure to lower prices, improve quality, or become more efficient. But the opposite argument also deserves consideration. A young factory in Burkina Faso may be competing against foreign producers with decades of experience, enormous production volumes, established supply chains, and much greater access to capital. Giving a new domestic industry time to develop is not automatically bad economics. The real question is what happens during that protected period. Does production rise? Do prices become more competitive? Does quality improve? Are sustainable jobs created? Can the company eventually compete without permanent protection? And there is another important point. There is no solid evidence that France, the United States, the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank is opposing SOFATO simply because Burkina Faso is processing tomatoes. In fact, Burkina Faso continues working with international financial institutions while pursuing greater economic sovereignty. That distinction matters. Economic sovereignty does not have to mean economic isolation. For Traore, the harder challenge is proving that domestic control and international engagement can exist together while building industries strong enough to survive real competition. SOFATO may become one of the clearest tests of whether that balance can actually work. Now return to that small can of tomato paste. By itself, it is not proof of an economic revolution. It is a test. The real measure of success will not be an inauguration ceremony, a political speech, or photographs of new machinery. 5 years from now, will the factory still be operating? Will farmers have a dependable market? Will workers have sustainable jobs? Will production costs fall as volume increases? And will families continue buying the product because they trust its quality and can afford its price? Then comes the regional test. Will a shopper in Mali or Niger choose a Burkinabe product when other brands are sitting beside it? Could consumers in Ghana eventually recognize a processed tomato brand from Burkina Faso, just as traders already recognize Burkinabe fresh tomatoes? If that happens, the lesson for Africa will be larger than SOFATO. African countries possess enormous agricultural resources, but owning the raw material is only the beginning. More value can be retained when African businesses also process, package, brand, transport, and sell what African farmers produce. That lesson reaches far beyond tomatoes. For Burkina Faso and Ibrahim Traore, SOFATO can become a visible test of economic sovereignty. For Mali under Assimi Goïta and Niger under Abdourahmane Tchiani, it raises a broader AES question. Can the sale build stronger trade between neighboring African economies instead of remaining heavily dependent on finished goods from distant markets? That does not require hostility toward France, Europe, or anyone else. It requires African businesses capable of competing. A factory is capacity. A competitive business is success. That may be the most important lesson for West Africa, the African Union, and anyone following African news today. So tell us what you think. Should African governments protect young industries while they develop, even when locally produced goods initially cost more? Or should those businesses face full international competition immediately? Share your view below. And if you want to keep following how Burkina Faso and the wider Sahel turn political ideas into measurable economic results, subscribe and join us for the next story. Because if one small can move from a Burkinabe farmer to kitchens across Africa by winning customers on quality and price, that would be something worth celebrating. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.